Thank you, everybody. I'll introduce myself and my colleague, and then we'll get started with our guests. My name is Esther Ann, and Tliwiz Esther Ann at Wabanaki Festimugari Nil. I'm Wabanaki, I'm Passamaquoddy, and I work for the Capacity Building Center for Tribes up here in Wabanaki, also known as Maine. And I'll let my colleague Sarah introduce herself.
Thank you so much, Esther, and thank you for guiding us through that meditation today. Hello, everyone. My name is Sarah Nelson. I'm an enrolled member of the Sault Ste. Marie Tribe of Chippewa, and I work with the Capacity Building Center for Tribes. It is great to be here with all of you, and I have a couple pieces of really quick technical housekeeping before we get started. If you have any questions today, please use the Q&A in the bottom of your screen and ask our facilitators a question. Your videos and your microphones have automatically been turned off and muted. And we ask that you keep an eye on the chat. We'll be sharing resources and links there throughout our meeting today. We will also be sharing a link to an evaluation survey at the end of our meeting and encourage you to please fill that out so you can help us build better webinars and resources. And thank you so much, everyone. And I am going to pass it over to our facilitators, and we will start with Kimee.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Esther, for that grounding. I really needed that one today. If you don't mind, could you go ahead and advance the slide, please? Hello, my name is Kimee Wind-Hummingbird. I'm Muskogee. And in addition to the work that I do with the Center for Tribes, I also work at the National Native Children's Trauma Center. I apologize, I'm a little bit under the weather today, so just if you bear with me. Thank you guys so much. But prior to me joining the team at the National Center 2 years ago, I worked in Indian child welfare for 22 years. So this is all I know is working within our communities with our people to serve them, to help meet them where they are and provide them with resources that they need to be whole as a family again. And I'm going to pass it over to my colleague Lisa to introduce herself.
Buju Ginawa, Sagamakwe Indigo Ojibwe Mong, Gizi Nadodame, Mashkizi Bing Nandunjaba. I shared with you my spirit name. My English name is Lisa. I am Eagle Clan, and I am Bad River Ojibwe from northern Wisconsin. I'm currently with National Native Children's Trauma Center as a training technical assistant, but I have a background in tribal child welfare, and I supervised all of our Indian child welfare cases and staff while working for the Lukutare tribe in Hayward, Wisconsin, and I am very happy to be here today. Thank you.
Thanks, Lisa. Next slide, please. So I know that we always try to open up in a good way, and I know there are some amazing Indigenous leaders that we have out there, but I came across this quote many years ago. I think it's probably whenever I first started in Indian child welfare in the late 90s, and I think this just rings true. The happiest people I've ever met, regardless of their profession, their social standing, or their economic status, are the people that are fully engaged in the world around them. The most fulfilled people are the ones who get up every morning and stand for something larger than themselves. They are the people who care about others, who will extend a helping hand to someone in need, or will speak up when an injustice and speak up about an injustice when they see it. And I think probably each one of us in our work in Indian child welfare probably does this on a daily basis. Sometimes we might be the only voice in the room that has a certain opinion, but it's important that we say that. We speak up for our families in need. We speak up for our nations. Even when our voice quivers, we speak up. Thank you. Next slide, please. So some of our learning objectives today, we first want to talk about adaptive leadership and reflective supervision, including trauma-informed strategies to meet the needs of your team. And then we're also going to understand the differences between coaching and mentoring and learn the importance of these practices reflecting community values. And then we're going to acknowledge that traumatic experiences have the potential to influence approaches to supervision. Next slide, please. So adaptive leadership, we know that it's where we engage the tribal child welfare supervisor's ability to think creatively about approaches to challenging aspects of the child welfare work that we do. So how can we support children and their caregivers when they're experiencing stress and trauma? And taking that thought process just one step further, as tribal child welfare supervisors, how do we support the child welfare professionals on our staff who are the lifeline for these families in their most challenging times, their crisis, the families that we come across, it might be, we might see them whenever they've had the most life-changing event in their lives. And how do we as systems support them? And then again, we as supervisors support our staff that walks alongside them. So we know that a safe and compassionate child welfare professional learns how to support parents and caregivers to support children. But we as tribal child welfare supervisors are charged with growing a safe and compassionate child welfare system that supports child welfare professionals and helps them manage the challenging aspects of day-to-day child welfare work. Adaptive leadership can be defined as the act of mobilizing a group of individuals to handle tough challenges and emerge triumphant in the end. Successful leaders must engage and support staff at all levels of the organization. We have to generate buy-in by completing or connecting the foundational goals of tribal child welfare practice and the long-standing beliefs, culture, and practices of our communities. Leaders set the tone, and they share the vision of the culturally appropriate services to fit the unique needs of each community. In 2009, Ronald Heifetz identified two core processes of the practice that involves adaptive leadership, and that is diagnose and then action. Next slide, please. Reflective supervision requires active listening and thoughtful questioning by both parties. The role of the supervisor is to help the supervisee to answer their own questions and to provide the support and knowledge necessary to guide the decision-making. We know that this approach expands on the idea that supervision has a context of learning and professional development. We're going to watch a quick video about reflective supervision. Next slide, please.
The work that child welfare professionals do with young children and their families who have experienced trauma can be very intense. Because our brains are biologically wired to feel protective of babies and young kids, working with children who have experienced abuse or neglect can produce strong reactions. For child welfare workers, the intensity of these feelings, along with rising caseloads and increasing toxic stress on families, can lead to higher rates of burnout, secondary trauma, and turnover. One way to support workers dealing with trauma is through a model of professional development known as reflective supervision. This method, also sometimes called reflective consultation, provides professionals with a place to talk candidly about the inevitable stresses of their work on an ongoing, regularly scheduled basis. Whether done one-to-one, in small groups, in person, by phone, or online, reflective supervision aims to provide a safe, trusted relationship for learning so that workers can feel heard and validated. This relationship, often with a supervisor or consultant trained in infant and early childhood social and emotional development, also provides a crucial way to integrate research-based knowledge about supporting early childhood development into casework. When family needs are high, professionals have found it helpful to have a better understanding of the science of early brain development, attachment, trauma, and resilience as they make decisions within their roles. A central tenet of reflective supervision is the idea that how you are is as important as what you do. child welfare professionals who have experienced a compassionate, reflective supervision relationship can bring that compassion to their work with families. Those who've been through the process talk about how it helps them consider the different perspectives, cultures, and life experiences of the children and families they're working with. Reflective supervision works. Experts in the field of home visiting, early intervention, and Head Start have all recognized that when professionals receive regular reflective supervision, they report a decrease in secondary traumatic stress and burnout symptoms. As a result, more and more systems, like child welfare, are bringing reflective supervision into their work because they can see the significant benefits it brings to professionals and the families they serve.
Thank you. Next slide, please. So as we talk about reflective supervision and, of course, working within our communities, we have to first acknowledge that there is historical trauma within the communities that we work. And sometimes those ripple effects continue to affect us on a daily basis in the lives that we lead, and not just within the families that we walk alongside, but also in us as humans. I know that I continue to feel ripple effects of historical trauma in my life today on a daily basis. So as a former child welfare worker and supervisor and manager, I had to understand that sometimes maybe whenever I was challenged by some of the work that I was doing with my families, that I had to recognize that that was my issue. That was my own trigger trauma. And I had to acknowledge that I needed to take a step back and be reflective on what I was doing and walking alongside these families. And also for the team that surrounded me, not just as a worker itself or as a manager, just having a good solid foundation and a good team to help have these conversations with, to help grow as a child welfare worker and grow as a child welfare supervisor. And some of those building blocks are, of course, we talked about reflection and then collaboration and then regularity. Can you click it, please? So in reflection, talk about honesty and trustworthiness, not only walking alongside the families that we work with, but also in who we are as supervisors and managers and child welfare workers. We have to build that foundation with the family, and it has to be based on trust and honesty and transparency. And then we have to explore the issues related to the work and the families. And like I mentioned earlier, sometimes acknowledging that some of this we bring with us to the table, and it's because we've lived in our communities, we've worked in our communities for so long, it's there. But how do we find the tools to turn that off whenever we have to address an issue within the families that we're working with? And then identify next steps with using active listening and thoughtful questioning. Click, please. In collaboration, it's about shared responsibility. I feel like a lot of times in our tribal communities, we understand that we have a responsibility to the community in more than one way. We have a responsibility to the community because of who we are, being from that community, but then also as a service provider to the families in that community. And we have those relationships look different outside of Indian country than they do within our tribal communities. So we need to acknowledge that. And then offering new tasks and decision-making responsibilities within our team. We should definitely uplift the voices and the skills of our team to ensure that we're using them to the best of their potential. And then regularity. We have to have these sessions, these meetings with our staff regularly scheduled. And I want to acknowledge the fact that, working in child welfare as long as I did, I know that whenever you have something planned at 8:30 on Monday morning, you walk through the door at 8 o'clock and it looks completely different. And sometimes you're not able to do what you had planned at 8:30 a.m. until 8:30 p.m. But it's important that we do set aside time to work with our staff to make sure that they have the tools and the skills that they need to successfully engage these families. And then also, we have to be fully engaged in those conversations. We have to be present. And what I mean by that is not just being in the room with them. We need to be listening. We need to be actively listening. We need to be asking thoughtful questions. We need to make sure that we allow time for them to ask us questions and be prepared to answer those questions. And in some cases, it might not just be verbally, it might be showing them. It might be like, this is how in the past I've dealt with this in this way. And if you'd like to, I can come along with you to your meeting with this family and we can have this conversation together. Okay, next slide. I think I'm going to hand this off to Lisa.
Thank you. So there's a difference between mentoring and coaching. And this becomes really important, especially in tribal child welfare, especially if it's a tribal program. There are different rules about who can be hired. So for example, if it's a state or county agency, they may be only able to be drawing from those who are either have degrees in bachelor's of social work or master's of social work, or are currently working on their degrees. Whereas in tribal child welfare, often we don't have those stipulations. So it becomes even more important when we're bringing on new staff to offer mentoring and coaching. Mentoring is more kind of like offering advice. So an example would be like if you are going through something just personally, maybe you would reach out to a friend or someone that you really trust. Whereas with coaching, it's more such as, how do I do this? Can you show me? Can you click with, yep. Coaching is more action orientated. So if you would think in child welfare, sorry, I forgot to start my video. An example for mentoring could be just having a worker be able to come in and talk to you and ask for advice, or talking to them about how they can start building their skills or improving their skills. Whereas coaching, on the other hand, is, hey, we are going to be running a family group conference today, and I would really like you to take the lead. And I will be there to help and supervise, but let's go over a plan and then make an agenda ahead of time. But putting that staff member in that position to be able just to start utilizing those skills and practicing those skills, but still under kind of like the supervision of someone who has more experience. This is really beneficial when you have veteran workers, and you also have workers who may be just coming into the field or who don't have a lot of experience, and offering both mentoring and coaching is very beneficial. I have seen where tribes, and I myself have even been asked to either mentor or coach other workers from other tribes. So for example, when I was working in tribal child welfare, I would often have other tribes ask if they could send workers to us for a few days to not only shadow our cases, but to be mentored and to actually for us to coach them in what they can do. This happened one time, and I had such like a planned agenda with working for this individual from a northern Michigan tribe. But on day 2, when he came, I had received notification at like 6 o'clock in the morning that the tribal law enforcement had just done a drug raid. There were 6 small children in the home, and we had to work to find placements for the children. So he got to go from just like mentoring and kind of shadowing to, I was kind of throwing him in and having him help our team, because it took the entirety of our team to be able to work through what was happening that day. And he got to actually just put his hands on and get right in there, right alongside with us. But both mentoring and coaching are very valuable and helpful, and help build the team and help build the leadership and the skills within the team. Next slide. So I know that this is webinar mode, but we would like to just ask if you can share in chat that if your tribal child welfare program, or if the agency that you work for, if they currently offer mentoring or coaching for your staff. And I'll just let a few minutes to see if any of you, give you time to respond. I'm seeing a lot of no's. And I know, like, a lot of times, like, our programs are so, every day there's constant fires, and overwhelmed with cases coming in and dealing with crises, and that sometimes it's really difficult to be able to build a lot of that in. But even like for a supervisor in particular, to build a network of well-known professionals who have veteran professionals who have been at it at a long time, and to be able to try to match the newer workers with those, and creating a relationship or a peer relationship between those two, so the worker can also be able to call upon, like that type, like the worker as well, just to ask questions or to advise. Or even like, hey, I'm in the thick of things. Can you help me, coach me through this and help me understand, what to do? I'm seeing that there's a lot who actually have like a lot of mentoring and coaching programs as well. I'm going to just take some time. Yes, I see. I wish a manager had more time to offer this. Unfortunately, in tribal child welfare, that's one of our realities, that, we're just so busy and so overwhelmed with our caseload that it becomes very difficult. Just trying to go through this. But even if you don't have type of mentoring or coaching, that's what we're kind of working on with capacity building for tribes, is trying to establish more of a peer network and trying to connect Indian country all the way from Alaska all the way to like the East Coast, and to be able to build the relationships and get to know each other, for programs to be able to build those relationships as well, and to be able to reach out to each other to say, hey, what are you doing? What programs are you implementing? What creative things are going on in your program that maybe I can utilize? If your program doesn't have coaching or mentoring, just try to think about, after today's webinar, to be able to bring that back to your team, to your agency, to where you work, and see if we can start building that capacity. Next slide. So in one of the unique identifiers in working in tribal child welfare is usually we work in communities that are very small, are very close knit, and where everybody knows everybody. It's not unusual for there to be workers in a tribal child welfare program who, when a new case come in, they have a relationship, whether it's through family or even ceremonial or spiritual, some type of relationship that in some ways may be seen as a conflict. There are often a lot of difficulties being a worker or a staff member within such a community that you're so closely connected to, because when things are happening in the community, it's also affecting and happening to you. It's also creating a lot of issues to where it becomes hard to be out in a community as well. I know that, and I often share the example that, when I was working, when I would go to Walmart or grocery shopping, and this is when stores were actually open 24 hours, I would actually try to go like really late at night or in the early morning hours, just because usually during the busier times during the day or early evening, often you're running into like a lot of clients, and it was trying to just kind of having that a little autonomy or that little separation from work and home life, and being able to just be me and to be my, like mom, and to do my mundane family task. But sometimes in communities, it's really difficult having that balance or having that line, because we're a part of the community. A lot of times, like it's one of our strengths, because when we know our community so well and we know what the strengths of a family are, we can build that into the work we do. But it also can have a negative effect where it can lead to biases that we need to be aware of and work through, or that we are just aware of, that we may have conflicts of interest. For example, if I know that there's a case coming in involving like a family that I'm close with or that I'm related to, it's just up to me to state that, I'm not the best one to work on this, and I needed someone else to work on this that is more objective or who doesn't have that type of relationship. A lot of times, and especially in tribal communities, we have very limited resources. One of the major aspects of tribal child welfare programs is having access to mental health professionals, or to programs that can help staff, what the needs are in a tribal child welfare program. And a lot of times, maybe there's only one or two providers, or there's just such an overabundance of cases as well. It's hard to meet the needs. I know in tribal child welfare programs, when the mental health needs are in needs of a psychiatrist or someone who can actually prescribe medications, that is often a barrier as well. And having some of these limited resources, it can lead to us having secondary traumatic stress ourselves, or even being able to deal with the secondary trauma that we deal with. It becomes difficult in such small communities because we're often sharing the same resources as our clients as well. Again, it's still having a fine line between having our autonomy and our personal self and what our personal needs are, and our professional life as well. A lot of our communities have high rates of trauma. We are not immune to this, and we are very well aware that in tribal communities that trauma is very high. The historical trauma plays into our casework, our cases, our communities, with the children and the families that we are working with. And this adds stress to not only ourselves as workers, but to the children and families we work with, but the professionals that we're also referring our cases to and working alongside with to meeting the needs of the children and the family we are working with. This adds to the stress experience as well. Next click. And again, with the effects of historical trauma, especially when you work within the own community that you are a part of, and you carry your own historical trauma, whether it's localized to that community or, in the broader sense of historical trauma, it affects you as a worker and as a community worker. And when things are occurring in a community, such as a crisis, I know we're so close-knit in tribal communities that, it's just our way to come together to be able to help each other. And it becomes, hard and difficult as well when you're a community member as well as a professional. And you carry the role of being a professional, but you're also dealing with the trauma of the community as well, or the historical trauma that is coming through, not only through your cases, but through yourself as well. So it's just often really important to reflect on these type of things that are very individual to Indigenous workers working in Indigenous communities, and be able to work through these as a staff and to reflect on them, and to often just sit down and have conversations about how all of these aspects are affecting not only your staff, but the cases that you're working on and how it is affecting the children and the families you are working with as well. And I do see someone commented that about lateral violence. And yes, that is very important to also be aware of and address in Indigenous communities as well. Lateral violence is very well present in tribal communities, and more specifically in tribal child welfare, who is working through like a lot of trauma themselves. And those dynamics absolutely often come into play. Next slide. So what do you bring to the table as a supervisor? A supervisor is a unique individual because they're the liaison between, upper management, but as a staff, they're the liaison between the community as the whole and the goals of the program that you're working in. More specifically, like in tribal child welfare, they carry many hats, many roles, and many responsibilities. In regards to working as a supervisor in Indigenous communities, it is really important to create and nourish a supportive culture. What my experience has been is with the 2 tribal child welfare programs that I have worked in, your workers become your family. A lot of times, in tribal child welfare, we're not always there from 8 to 5. We're often there from 6 o'clock in the morning until, we can clear whatever is going on. And sometimes that's not until like 9 o'clock at night. A lot of times your coworkers, you may spend a lot more time with your coworkers than you do your actual family. There's a lot of times when you may be called out into the field in the middle of the night if you have like on-call services and you're working with your coworkers in that. So it's really important to build and establish a culture that is safe within your tribal agency or your tribal child welfare program, and to create and nourish just relationships that work well together. Next, click. And as a supervisor, it's one of the hats to wear is to monitor the trauma exposure. Tribal child welfare, we are exposed to trauma on a daily basis. And it's just coming in many forms, whether it's just from the on the ground work that we're doing on a daily basis, whether it's from the tribal politics that are going on, or from the community and what is occurring on a whole. But trauma exposure is a very real experience in tribal child welfare, and it is a predictable hazard for anyone working in tribal child welfare. It is really important as a supervisor to get to know your staff and their personalities, and to be able to watch for the signs when exposure is really affecting one or even all of your individual workers. For example, I just remember when working in LCO, I have one worker who was always very bubbly and would like to pull pranks almost every day, or would just be full of, like goofiness throughout the day. And she would really use her humor just to kind of uplift everybody. But if I notice that she's quiet and she's not bubbly, that was an indication as a supervisor that I should probably pull her in and say, hey, what's going on? And I kind of noticed like a change in your affect today. Just talk to me, what's going on? Or you can even have the opposite, where you have a quiet worker who all of a sudden is just like talking and rambling and just running around. That's another indicator of trauma as well, that, they may be overwhelmed. And that may be also a time to kind of focus on that individual worker. And to just take notice just in the general staff and what their demeanor is, how they're doing, and noticing the fluctuations and the differences as a whole as well. Next, click. And as I said, it's just really important to really get to know those who you work with, and to get to know their personalities and even their strengths that they bring to the table. Or even, if like a certain type of case can be very hard for a certain worker, just knowing that not assigning a case that may affect a worker in a certain way or a negative way, or add to their trauma exposure, is just having that knowledge and knowledge of who everyone is and how everyone can best cohesively work together, and just watching for the signs of trauma as well. Next, click. And also, it's important to really understand the motivations for working in difficult and emotionally taxing fields. Not everyone is geared for it. There are those who are just completely awesome for it, and who, can work through, all the difficult situations, or who just have like the natural resilience and the capacity to be able to deal with crises. And there are those who just, it's very hard. And I have seen both type of workers. It's really important in knowing, like when you are working on hiring new staff and you're going through the interviewing process, having questions surrounding during the interviews about what are the motivations about why they want to get into, tribal child welfare. Trying to take that opportunity to even like educate them a little about, what the what the expectations are about, like the trauma exposure that they will be experiencing. And, just using that while asking questions possibly about how do you best deal with stress in like high stress situations. That can kind of help make choices about who will fit in the field, in the work, or with your coworkers, or do, like the agency that you're working with just as well. It's also important to ask questions about, when times are tough, how is it that you take care of yourself? What are ways that you deal with the emotions, that you experiencing when things are really difficult? Do you have like a support network? Because those become really important, especially when their workers are hired and working in the field as well. Next click. And again, building the relationships to create the cohesive team. We talked a little bit about that. And kind of earlier, I also talked about trying to, as programs, I really encourage expanding and building relationships with maybe other area teams that are nearby, or even, as I had talked about before, connecting with peers nationally on a national level. And I know capacity building for tribes is really trying to incorporate that and work with that and help build that as well, and to build those networks. But building those relationships helps not only build the skills of workers, but it helps build the capacity of like individual child welfare programs as well. I know when I'm working in Wisconsin, we had where we would meet quarterly with other tribal child welfare programs, and we are always hearing about what programs are implementing or what other tribal child welfare programs are doing and what is working or what isn't. And we would often just share those resources with each other or help each other build on those capacities or build programs or to implement them as well. So being able to build those relationships become really important as well. Next slide. Oh, and supporting staff members' development of personal and professional trauma-informed and trauma-responsive skill sets. I can't express or encourage this enough. Taking opportunities wherever they may come. We are now in like the era where a lot of these type of trainings or opportunities are often virtual or offered virtually as well. Whereas before the pandemic, a lot of times it was in-person trainings that programs may not have had the resources to send to. But even trying to, within like a community or within a region, trying to build or create opportunities for area workers as well is very beneficial, or trying to share upon the collaboration or sharing those resources, or even the cost of bringing those resources to the workers as well. Those are some ideas to kind of bring to the table as well. Next slide. And we will open up for any questions or comments. Feel free to share questions and comments either with the question and ask link or the chat.
Yes, Shonda, we will definitely make sure the presentation is shared.
And Lisa, it looks like we have a question from Emily Ironcloud. Emily, you are able to speak if you would like.
I can't see the question if she typed it. Can you share it?
I think she did put it in, if it's the same question. Oh, no, it wasn't hers. Somebody else asked if it can be shared. Emily, you have to unmute yourself, I think, to be able to, for us to hear you. There you go.
Okay. Okay, so my question is, have you thought about or have you explored bringing your cultural practices, ceremonies and traditions into addressing trauma with staff, children and families?
I have had the great experience of, I was assistant director and I had a director that would often, like, if she saw like we were just having a tough time, she would just walk in with a smudge bowl. And she would walk around our offices and smudge down our offices, or use that as a time to also kind of just, I hate the word debriefing, but just come together and talk through what's going on. And we did use that a lot. But there's also opportunities to always bring culture and ceremonies into not only for the staff, but the children and family you're working with. Often my coworkers and I, a few of us would go to sweat lodge together, or we would go to ceremonies in the summer together. And that was always helpful.
Just to kind of piggyback on that too, I agree wholeheartedly. It's so important for us to tap into those traditional ways of being. And like Lisa mentioned, not only in the way that we're working or assisting our staff, but also the way that we're engaging our families. And I know from, doing this work outside of Indian country too, that, we'll talk about some of these amazing initiatives that are going on within Indian country. And they'll say, oh my gosh, that's so cutting edge. Like, where did you come up with that at? And I'm like, no, it's not something that's new to us. It's us taking a step back and looking inward to some of the practices that we've done since time immemorial, to really tap into the ways that make us whole. And so, yes, we've had the opportunity to hear from some amazing programs across Indian country about some of those things, how they're intentionally incorporating those in some of the, and like Lisa mentioned the word debriefing, it's, in their team meetings or in their, some of them start off the morning that way. We've also, there's some new practices, and I see Maria's on the call through the chat. I know that there's some potentially new initiatives about resilience buddies, having those conversations with starting the morning, with what some of the challenges that you're seeing for yourself, and then potentially breaking off and getting a coworker, a colleague that you can help process through. And if it takes you away from the office, like if you're taking a 15-minute break to walk around, to get in touch with nature, to get outside, those are important too, because the way that, we all know that we have to make sure that we're taking care of ourselves in order to better serve the families that we come in contact with. Was that helpful to you?
And it's also helpful to be able to not only refer staff, but children and families you're working with to spiritual leaders within the community. I know that there's a lot who, ask for namings or sweat lodge ceremonies, or whatever it is, but being able to offer those referrals as well. Are there any other questions?
It just about takes us to time. I think we have your contact information there and a beautiful fiddlehead. It's fiddlehead season right now, so that's appropriate. So if there's no other questions, I think Sarah's gonna put in the chat a link to a follow-up conversation we're having on June 1st.
Yes, thank you,
Yes.
Esther. So if anyone is interested, we will be hosting on Thursday, June 1st, a 1-hour sharing space for folks to come together and talk about trauma-informed supervision, this webinar, the previous webinar, and have some time with our facilitators. If you are interested, go ahead and register at the link that I just popped into the chat, and I will also be following up with an email that includes a copy of today's recording, as well as a copy of that link and our survey as well. And so thank you so much, everyone. I hope you have a great rest of your day. Anything else from our facilitators or from Esther?
Oh, thank you so much for joining us, Mado.
Thank you, everybody.
Take care, everyone.